It's an absolute pleasure to have Brian here today. I certainly regard him as one of the most innovative of the plant ecologists of his generation. Really exciting work you've done. Brian's currently on sabbatical over in geography, and it's really wonderful that he can join us today. Brian received his PhD in 1998 from the University of New Mexico under the mentorship of ecologist James H. Brown. With the help of collaborators, they developed what I regard as one of the truly groundbreaking theories, metabolic scaling theory, which provides a fundamental basis for scaling biological processes across space and time. I was absolutely fascinated when the first metabolic scaling papers came out, and I actually used it as the basis for undergraduate admissions questions for a few years for more students. Following his doctoral work, Brian held prestigious postdoctoral fellowships at Santa Fe Institute and the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis at UC Santa Barbara. Currently, Brian is a professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Arizona, as well as being an external faculty member at the Santa Fe Institute, a leading interdisciplinary research center dedicated to understanding complex adaptive systems. He also co-directs the Bridging Biodiversity and Conservation Science program at Arizona Institute of Resilience. So quite a busy guy. Central to Brian's work is the development of a predictive framework for scaling biological processes from individual organisms for the whole ecosystem. His lab also leads the BN, Biological Information and Ecology Network, focused on developing a general open source workflow to standardize and integrate botanical biodiversity and traits data. This work is building novel approaches to complex, innovative problems using intricate computing, big data, and statistical tools to visualize and analyze biological data and assess how climate change will influence the distribution of biodiversity. That's a very potted summary of Brian and what he does. Really, really excited that you're here, and thank you very much for coming to speak.
Thank you, David. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. And I've followed David's work for quite some time now, so it's great to be able to overlap. So today what I wanted to do is cover bits of some research that we're focused on having to do with impacts of climate change, human land use on basically the future of biodiversity and the biosphere. Now, I don't want to give anything away, but I'm not really going to be able to answer those questions because those are very complicated questions, but I'm going to show you some of our attempts to deal with these issues. Okay. Fast forward, right? So we're coming out of this grand decade of studying biodiversity from the United Nations, right? And so now we have some agreed upon global targets for how we best conserve biodiversity and how we should go about our process of ecologists and scientists, biodiversity scientists, in terms of how we can basically best attempt to kind of aim for these targets. And so this Convention of Biological Diversity is trying to address some of the underlying drivers, not only of extinction, but also various different threats then to biodiversity. But now we have some minimum targets in terms of trying to aim for minimizing extinction risk. Okay? And so in a lot of my talk today, I'm going to be talking about extinction risk and the impacts, functional impacts of extinction. So the overarching question is, can we address this thorny issue? Can we predict the future of biodiversity, right? And so I look to my colleagues and the atmospheric scientists with envy, with their predictive ability to say something about how, with various changes in greenhouse gases, we can actually predict the high resolution and spatial and temporal scales, futures of temperature, precipitation, and so on. So I think that's kind of the gold standard that we as biologists should shoot for in terms of understanding the future of the biosphere. Can we develop such a predictive science? So we all know what biodiversity is, more or less, right? The diversity and variety of life on the planet. And we know to some degree what the biosphere is, right? So the biosphere then defines basically this interface between all these various spheres then on the planet and how living things influence then the Earth system itself. And biodiversity effectively defines then the functioning then of the biosphere. Okay, and so the challenge is, well, how do we actually do this? How do we map out and have a better kind of way of understanding the functioning of the biosphere in the future? Okay. So to do this, our group has been grappling with what we kind of call three central challenges in order to develop a predictive science of the biosphere. And the first one is really, how do you forecast? How do you actually predict what's going to happen to biodiversity as well as the biosphere under differing climate and human land use scenarios, right? So as biodiversity scientists, we want to be able to provide very reliable, repeatable predictions for what's going to happen in the future, all right? Realistic predictions, something that we can actually come to some sort of common agreement on, right? Now, this is complicated. This is a challenge. I'm not going to, sugarcoat it. This is very difficult. How do we do this? So we need to kind of do a few things. We need to define boundaries. We need to estimate things like extinction risk under these different scenarios. So we know there's going to be rapid changes in biodiversity. It's already happening, right? But can we say something more in terms of these various different visions then of the future, these different scenarios that we're heading into? So I and many of my colleagues and good people that I collaborate with all see this influx of these various data streams as promising, right? So for the first time, we now have the ability to watch the globe and watch the biosphere in real time. Now, we have a tremendous amount of data and various different data streams that is now rapidly changing how we monitor then life on Earth. And so we have this remarkable ability to say something in almost continuous time. Now, one challenge here is how then we best make use of all of this data, how we integrate all of this data. Now, this overload of data also presents a serious second challenge. And that second challenge has to do with how do we maintain open science that is creating repeatable workflows, okay, that we can apply kind of in general across the various different fields to say something about biodiversity and the functioning of the biosphere. And so these are big informatics challenges. And of course, as these big data streams are increasing exponentially across the board, that then opens up a series of challenges having to do with how we can best harness this new influx of data. And so in an effort then to try to make sense of how we can best kind of leverage various different data sets, one challenge that we identified and we outlined in this paper here is the problem of integration of these various different data sources. It turns out that there are a lot of different data sources having to do with biodiversity on the planet. The problem is that they're not integrated. And so one thing that we found is that if you go through the effort of integrating the current data that we have, that would be the equivalent of advancing 23 years in biodiversity knowledge. And that's just with data integration, right? And so that is our best estimate in terms of the overall importance of this informatics problem, okay? So just focusing on integration alone and cleaning and scrubbing will give us decades of advancement in terms of our knowledge of biodiversity. And so the third challenge is actually to go beyond species diversity and species richness. A lot of ecology and biodiversity science is based on counting the number of species. But for the things that we want to say in terms of ecosystem services, and so in terms of nature's contribution then to people, requires measuring other attributes then of biodiversity, not just the number of species, but what those species and individuals actually do in the landscape, right? So in particular, focusing on the functional component of biodiversity. And so this functional component of biodiversity is really one of the only ways that we can begin to make these linkages between ecosystem functions, ecosystem services, and nature's contribution then to people. So how does one actually make these links to make those arrows functional then and predictive? That's the challenge. Right. And the next challenge is to go beyond biodiversity and traits, but to say something more about the magnitude of the impact then of those functions. And one way to do that is to increase our knowledge of relative abundance, the rarity and commonness then of species. But by combining traits and commonness and rarity, that then allows us to say something more about the magnitude of impacts in terms of how changes in abundance or changes in traits will then impact ecosystem and biodiversity and functioning. Okay, so I'm going to do three things in the talk today. I'm going to step back and ask just a very basic question having to do with biodiversity, species richness. We want to know for one very biodiverse group, plants, embryophytes on the planet, how many species there are. But then we want to take what we know about the number of species of plants on the planet to then begin to integrate some more additional information about abundance and about some other key traits in order to say something more about how changes then in species diversity will then lead then to changes in ecosystem and biosphere functioning. So I'm going to next focus on biodiversity and forecasting biodiversity and extinction. And then I'm going to end with some more recent work on forecasting the functioning of the biosphere, or attempt to struggle with each one of these. Okay. So this first attempt has really been over a decades-long effort. We thought that this was going to be relatively easy. We were going to meet as a working group at NCEES and pull together all of the plant biodiversity data that we know of in order to say something about global patterns of plant biodiversity data. And one thing that we discovered very quickly was that all of these various heterogeneous data streams had all of these issues and biases and errors associated with taxonomic names, geographic locations, you name it. Basically, a lot of attributes of our data are so biased that we couldn't even do the basic biodiversity science that we wanted using basic biodiversity observation data. And so over the last decade or two, we have been working on how do we deal with these kind of ungratifying aspects of biodiversity data. And so that has led to a series of efforts, including a BioFi effort funded by the National Science Foundation to do something what is probably the most fundamental attribute of biodiversity data, and that is the observation. And so our observations of biodiversity come from plots and surveys, specimens in herbarium museums and citizen science, as well as other measures of individuals, such as traits. And these are all observations. And they can be leveraged. They can be integrated to say and ask different questions as you then integrate them. And so the BN group has focused on integrating primary observation data and then dealing with the informatics issues associated then with them. And so we wanted to know a basic question: how many plant species are there on Earth? There's a lot of different approaches to this, but we just wanted to sum up and count every observation that has been made. But then we wanted to know what fraction then of those species are rare, right? And it turns out that we focused on rarity for one important reason. Because rarity, it turns out, is the best predictor of extinction risk. And it tells you something more about biodiversity, because what I'm going to tell you is that biodiversity is largely a matter of rarity. Biology of rarity is very important. All right, rare species are most prone to extinction. So we want to say something about where they are, who they are, and so on. Okay, so the BN working group is focused on informatics tools for data integration and dealing with a lot of the insidious errors and biases associated then with biodiversity data. And so we had focused on this workflow, creating an open, repeatable workflow that in dealing with primary observation data, everyone has to go through, integrating the data, but then doing some standardization and checks having to do with taxonomic standardization, geographic name and location standardization, geographic validation, status validation, dealing with bars and invasive species, and so on. And so these are all open source tools that are now published and available. And if you're interested, right, each one has associated R packages, APIs, as well as the underlying code all on GitHub. So after a decade, we created these tools in order to give us a better, we felt much more comfortable, I should say, in dealing with biodiversity data. And here's the numbers, all right? And so we took the world's biodiversity observation data. It's the best data streams that we could find. We came up with a total number of observations, and we're able to kind of break that down in terms of specimens and plots and surveys and trait observations. And we have an estimate that for the embryophytes, right, these are the land plants, there's about 435,000 species of embryophytes on the planet. Now, plus or minus, there's a certain amount here because there are still some biases and errors, but that's great. We have an estimate, okay? now can we actually do some science associated with that? So after we know more or less our standardized list of species, we wanted to say something more about linking these patterns of plant biodiversity to extinction. And so we very quickly kind of zeroed in to try to figure out if we could say something about rarity in all of these different species. Can we actually identify rare species? And so we first looked to ecological theory to tell us what we should expect to see, at least some estimates from theory a priori, to then tell us what we should expect to see at the global scale. Because what we wanted to do is that we wanted to have a global estimate of rarity, not a local measure of rarity, but a global estimate of rarity. And so if you're interested in this work, we published this a few years back. And if you look into the literature, there's actually several different predictions for what we should see about the distribution and commonness of rarity at the global scale, right? So how many rare species there are in total. All right, so we call this the Global Species Abundance Distribution, or GSAD, right? Be silly, right? The GSADs, right? So here's the space we're working in. Number of observations, proportion of species, right? We want to know where the common species are going to be sampled a lot, right? What does this space look like? So if you go to neutral theory, so Steve Hubble's neutral theory, it actually turns out that we have a prediction from neutral theory. And neutral theory generates a distribution, an inverse distribution that looks like this. That is, we should have a large fraction of species that are rare and a small fraction of species then that are common, okay? But the functional form of this should take a given form. It has a given mathematical flavor. In fact, it's a log series distribution. And it turns out that this is going to have a little bendiness on log-log scale, but the slope on that relationship should approximate -1, right? -1. Very nice prediction from neutral theory. It actually turns out that there's a different set of predictions that comes out from the central limit theorem, right? And the central limit theorem basically says that, well, we should expect to see a similar distribution, but this distribution is not a log series. It's actually going to be a log normal distribution. And it'll be a little different flavor of what that curve then looks like. And presumably the slope should maybe differ from -1, right? It could overlap, but in theory, it could actually be very different. It also says that most species will be rare. There's another theoretical insight. This is called the K-niche model. So this is from Steve Bacala's group in Princeton. They actually predict also a log series distribution, but the slope of this relationship should not be -1. It should actually be either steeper or shallower, depending on the various assumptions used for this niche theory and prediction. Great, we have some predictions. It should more or less look like this. All right, so what we did is we went through then all of the data for all the different species on the planet. We counted up how many times has a given species been observed, counted up the number of observation records total in the globe. And this is what you get. The curve actually looks pretty similar, but I'm showing you 3 different curves here. The blue curve is for all the specimen records, that is all the observations in herbaria across the globe. The green curve is from ecological plots or surveys. And we like these data because these are situations where you go out and you count everything, right? You're not missing anything. It's not haphazard sampling like museum records are. But it actually turns out the functional form of all these curves are indistinguishable from each other. They have the same mathematical signature. And it turns out that, when we analyze 200 million observation records, what we actually find is that if we look at the rare species, about 36% of all species on the planet are incredibly rare. These are species that have only been observed 5 times. Right? Only have 5 records or less. Right? 36% of all species on the planet have been observed in these global databases 5 times or less. What's interesting is that the functional form of this curve is different from neutral theory. The slope on this relationship, it turns out, is steeper than -1. It's actually -1.4, indicating that there are proportionally more rare species than you'd predict from neutral theory. But then also the functional flavor of this curve is a log normal and not the log series. So if you're interested in that, that's kind of cool. But the important takeaway point is that there's a lot of rare species in the world. And that opens up the next question: what's maintaining all of these rare species? And the first thing that we can do is ask, well, where are they? So we can go back and identify the species that are in the tails and plot them out. And then we can correct for sampling intensity. And these are hotspots of rarity. So the more intense the color indicates that there are proportionately more rare species than in that cell after we correct for sampling intensity, basically a rarefaction analysis. So where are these rare species clustered? Well, they tend to be in tropical mountains in general, but there's some other interesting kind of patterns associated with the data. The one important correlate of predicting where species rarity hotspots are, it turns out we went through all the different climate data and other potential drivers. It turns out the best predictor of rare species hotspots is the stability of past climate. So when we go back and look at climate velocity and climate change for the past 20,000 years, rare species then are clustered in regions of the planet that have not been undergoing fast climate change. And that is consistent with the expectation that rare species are found in these locations because they've been sheltered from extinction because of a stable climate. All right, so are these really rare species? Okay, take my word, yes, we didn't believe this at first. And so we did a lot of subsampling and we asked taxonomic experts. Long story short, rare species that we identified, the vast majority are indeed rare. All right, so changing gears, we want now to kind of think about what we learned about at least rarity and the fact that we can begin now to map species diversity and say something more about where possibly we can target conservation efforts. This is an extremely difficult subject, and there's a very large literature on that, so I don't want to minimize the importance of the work done on this. What we've tried to do is borrow some methods available then in the literature and ask what will happen then to these rare species, okay? And then after, once we know something about rare species, can we begin to say something about how best then to save them, okay? So we want to forecast then extinction risk. And so what we did was we compared past rates of climate change, current climate distribution, and then looked at kind of future climate change projections. And what this map is then showing you is the ratio of future climate velocity to past climate velocity, right? And so regions then that are basically red here and yellow are going to be experiencing the biggest then change in velocity. Okay, so we're looking then at where we're going to see the biggest change in the baseline velocity. So red and yellow means that these are locations on the planet then that are experiencing faster rate of change given their past. And what we can also then do is overlay the rare species hotspots and then forecast then these rare species then into the future. And what this heat map is then showing you is the redder than the color, those then are locations where the climate is moving faster outside of the observed climate envelopes of the species then that occur there. So we can identify a lot of the tropical mountain regions then that are going to be experiencing a differential and increasing velocity of rate of change. So these then would be areas of potential concern, okay, given worst case climate change scenarios. Okay. So to summarize this first part, all right, it's exciting times for biodiversity informatics because we can begin to answer or at least address some of these longstanding questions about mapping out plant biodiversity, but then saying something about potential drivers then of extinction, in particular rarity. And one of the main things I want you to kind of take home from this is that biodiversity has a very important signature associated then with rarity, right? Biodiversity is mainly rarity. That is, a very large fraction of species tend to be exceptionally rare. Okay. And so we can then use that with kind of observed maps of climate change and forecasts of climate change then to say something about what will happen to these rarity hotspots. Okay. So in shifting then gears to trying to say something about how potential conservation efforts then may influence extinction risks into the future, we kind of want to take this Convention of Biological Diversity, 30%, conserving 30% of both land and air and oceans by seeing how our kind of data can maybe help say something about conservation status. So currently we estimate that about 17% of land area is under kind of some form of conservation, right? And then we have kind of good old E.O. Wilson here, kind of bookending, possibly be great to have 50%, of the earth kind of conserved in some sort of protected area status. And so in working with Conservation International, we've tried then to kind of leverage the plant biodiversity data as well as animal distribution and abundance data to ask where, at least in tropical areas, where we should place protected areas given then climate change. So if you're interested with some of the methods, so our first paper here, led by Lee Hanna, published in the Ecography, tried then to outline kind of a scheme for how one, at least with the yen data, how we can then kind of try to answer then this question. So we took geographic distributions of almost 300,000 species, and then we modeled them under different greenhouse change then scenarios, including kind of a best case and worst case scenario. And then we varied the extent of terrestrial protected land, okay, from current kind of locations then to ultimately up to 50% then of the land area. And to do this, we used something called a zonation algorithm, right? And so the idea here is that we're going to try to identify then regions then of the planet, in particular within tropical areas, where we can prioritize conservation areas by then informing then this algorithm with the differences in the sizes then of the geographic ranges then of these species. And so we can then use the zonation then algorithm combined with things like the species area curve, number of species in any equal to the number of areas, so that as we increase the size of protected area, that will then include obviously more species. And so we can calculate an aggregate extinction risk then, and then go through this iterative algorithm to then identify regions then of greater priority. And so in this kind of map here that I'm showing you, these yellow areas, these are the current protected areas. And then this colorization then scheme here has to do with regions then based on the zonation then approach, kind of telling us these are kind of areas of potential focal points then for conservation. So we can overlay then the developed areas, then kind of high human land use, then in kind of this beige type color with the orange color, then of the existing protected areas, and then ask in this remaining matrix, what then are the areas under different climate change scenarios that could be more important. And so the zonation algorithm is iterative. You can do this multiple times, and then we can generate a extinction risk based on a minimum size area then that you would want then to protect for a given species. If it's below then a given area, then that is indicative then of potential extinction and concern. And then we can generate then these different curves. So this is the percent land area then conserved versus then extinction risk. That is, what fraction then of the observed land then that's conserved is then kind of best preserving the most amount then of species. And then we can kind of rerun then these scenarios, and then we can develop then these different curves. And so these different colors here, these different curves then for different tropical regions, with blue being Africa, green here being Asia, red then being the neotropics, okay? And so there's a solid curve and a dotted curve with each one of these. The solid curve then is the worst case climate change scenario. The dotted line then is the best case climate change scenario. And so in all these different regions then, we see the same kind of non-linear curve. That is, as we go from a small percentage of land then that's conserved to larger and larger, areas then that are conserved, the aggregate extinction risk then drops. And so there's a few things then that we can take away then from these curves. The first is that increasing protection area coverage, all right, from 17% to 30% definitely has an impact, right, in terms of extinction risk, and we can see that. But the other interesting thing is that just increasing the current to the CBD goals has a larger impact on potential extinction risk than the different climate change scenarios. So our decisions then in terms of where we're putting protected areas has potentially a bigger impact than on extinction risk than climate change then itself. The other aspect is that if we combine protected areas with climate change then mitigation, right, we can more than half the potential then for extinction risk. All right, so combining both protected areas as well as mitigating on climate change does have a multiplicative effect. And the end result of this is that, yes, you can create maps. We can have in the greener areas, regions then of the planet that, according to the zonation algorithm, tends to have a disproportionate then impact then on biodiversity and biodiversity conservation. So there's Africa, the Americas, and so on. So to summarize, we can begin then to use our global biodiversity data, the geographic ranges of species, forecasted future geographic ranges then of species, combine that with other methods having to do with identifying regions of the planet that are best suited then to help mitigate extinction risk, to then tell us something about how, as we change the amount of area then that's conserved, as well as undergo different climate change scenarios, we can begin then to identify regions of the planet that have a disproportionate impact on mitigating extinction. At least that's our best guess at this point. So I want to emphasize here, just to end out, that actually our decisions in terms of where to conserve then land, according to these simulations, have a bigger impact on future biodiversity than future climate change scenarios alone. Okay, so the last part, how can we then kind of take these different components and maybe say something more about the functioning of the biosphere? And I want to step back and kind of bring in the other aspect of biodiversity that is going to be very important for us to incorporate, and that is a functional viewpoint in particular traits. Again, the idea is that traits will better enable us to connect biodiversity to nature's contribution to people, as well as with ecosystem functioning. Now, the issue is how then do we actually develop these arrows, right? What's the science underlying then those arrows? How then do you make these connections? Well, I'm sure a lot of people have, read some of the functional trait literature. There's a lot of it now. There's a big focus now on measuring traits of species and individuals. And some of the overall take-home conclusions is that we can describe then this diversity of life in terms of a bunch of traits associated with this continuum of life history variation, like fast and slow species, right? As well as a series of additional traits that also characterize other life histories. And so we can identify now a set of traits associated with these continuums then of variability having to do with life histories and other aspects of demography and growth and so on. But one of the most prominent ones that people tend to focus on in the literature is this fast-slow continuum, right? And so there's also a big literature on what then are the various traits then that underlie all this fast-slow continuum and so on. But I want to step back, and because we're focused on the globe and the biosphere, we can actually make this simple, because it turns out that there's one trait kind of rules them all. I'm a little biased, but I've been kind of harping on this for a while. And that if we do a big PCA space on all the different plant species on the planet and plot out where all these different traits lie, there's a first axis of variation and a second axis of variation. This is the fast, slow economic traits, and the bottom is body size. And to make a lot of literature summarized, the most important trait of an organism, if you're going to measure one thing, is its size. Because size then will tell you most about the variation in physiology, life history and ecological processes. Won't tell you everything, but it's going to tell you a lot. So in an effort to step back and say something about how changes in one trait, in particular body size, may actually be influencing the biosphere, started collaborating with a series of folks here, including Yadvinder, Chris, Mike, and Andrew. And we focused on a shift, a global shift in a trait, body size, across the planet. And so it turns out that there's a pretty good literature now documenting what has been happening to the largest individuals on the planet. Largest plants, largest animal. And so we call them the megabiota. And there's a reason why we should be more concerned with the megabiota other than that they're charismatic. It turns out in terms of functioning, the megabiota are disproportionately important in terms of driving most of the ecosystem, landscape, and biosphere level processes. And I'm going to give you kind of three kind of backgrounds in terms of three patterns then that we use in order then to scale up what has been happening to body size on the planet. And so big organisms are more powerful. That is, they control more resources, they flux more resources, and they contain more carbon and nutrients. Big things are more powerful. But big things are also more rare, right? And so there's an inverse relationship between size and abundance locally. But then if you look at all things together, every location on the planet will have a curve that looks like this. This is a size spectra. If you sample any insect, bird, mammal, plant community, you're going to get an inverse relationship between size of individuals and their local abundance. And this will hold across scales. Right? Now, we can use some math. I'm not going to go into the math, but there is one thing I want you to take home from the math, is that when we look at things like ecosystem metabolism or the total amount of carbon, total amount of nutrients, or the total amount of flux then of carbon and nutrients and various things, and if we use these different distributions and we put them together, what comes out is what dominates, especially in large samples, is the size of the largest individual. And so the size of the largest individual dominates the flow of resources, dominates the amount of carbon, dominates the store of carbon and nutrients, but then also, without going into a lot of details, big things tend to be central nodes and interactions that have a disproportionate impact on other species. But that's a different story. So it turns out that if you were to step back from the planet and probably ask one of the additional signature other than land use of humans on the planet and increase in greenhouse gases, but if you just looked at the biodiversity of the planet, one of the main signatures of the rise of humanity has been the trophic downgrading of the planet. That increasingly we've lost the largest individuals of plants and animals in the ocean, on land, and so on. And the future loss of biodiversity is also going to be characterized by this signal, is the further reduction of the biggest things on the planet. And so just with the loss of the largest plants, just to kind of drive home this point, over 15 billion trees are cut down each year, but it's disproportionately the biggest ones that are lost. And since then, the rise of human civilization, the biggest things have been the ones to go first. So we can characterize in a cartoon what that looks like, right? This is trophic downgrading, right? We basically start winnowing away the loss of the biggest things. It's gradual, but over time, this reduction has been happening across the planet. Now, we wanted to simulate this because we know the big things are really important, and we want to model the entire biosphere. So we used the Mattingly model, right, which is a biosphere simulation model. It's a general ecosystem model, or GEM, but we can run it then at the biosphere kind of scale. And in each of these pixels, we can put in these body size rules of metabolism and population density and so on. It's relatively simple, but we can run it, and then we can calculate a bunch of things under different scenarios. We can do these different experiments. right? And so we can go to the Pleistocene world, like kind of right at the time when humanity was coming on the scene. We can do the modern world and a potential future world. And we can do the trophic downgrading. And then we can keep track in the Mattingly model a lot of these various different ecosystem level attributes. Like we have the total biomass, we have the total heterotrophic metabolism. I should say we just did this for animals. The total metabolism of all heterotrophs on the planet, and the global nutrient fertility. That is the pace at which nutrients are moving then through the biosphere then itself. We go to the Pleistocene world, the modern world, and then the future world. We can just run these simulations. And all we're doing is we're just losing the size of the largest individuals. This has a huge effect within the Mattingly model. The global heterotrophic biomass into the future world would reduce 44%. The total metabolism drops by almost 18%. And the total nutrient fertility, that is the ability then of at least these animals in the simulation to move nutrients across the world, would be reduced by about 90%. Right? And that's just with the loss of the largest individuals. Now, this is a quick pass through how we estimate the impact of just the loss of the biggest things. And so what we want now to do is try to get a better handle on what has been happening with some of the biggest things. In particular with trees and plants, right? Because they're important metabolically, photosynthesis and carbon. And so we want to know about the future of the largest trees. And so this is something that we're grappling with right now. So we know that drought risks are increasing across the planet. We know that there's this signature of drought in forests across the world associated with increased mortality, right? And so mortality obviously is the loss of that metabolic potential, with the potential then loss of the carbon then that's stored within plants. And so we're trying then to find ways of identifying where are these big things, right? And so we have now turned to trying to utilize the JEDI data. So this is LiDAR based on the International Space Station. It goes around then the planet and maps out basically the height of vegetation. And so what's nice is that we can use this to identify regions of really tall vegetation, big trees. And so in collaborating with Laura Duncanson and her group, we're trying then to identify using JEDI, these now continuous maps then forest height, changes then in forest height, but also where these biggest things are, where the big trees, and what has been happening then with them. We've teamed up with several hydrologists here at Rutgers University. We've now put out global layers of current, historical, current, and future drought using something that's called the SPEI, or the Standardized Precipitation Evaporation Index, which is probably one of our better measures of drought as it relates to the physiology then of plants. So these are high resolution then maps associated then with potential drought risk. And so we can use then these time series generated then by these maps to identify things like the frequency of drought events, right? So negative values here would indicate increasing drought events. And we can identify these extreme then values then of drought. And so we can then combine what we know about the distribution of forests. This is one of the forest maps then generated then by JEDI. And then we can identify where in the forested biomes, you see the darker than colors here, these are then the extreme height quantiles, identifying then pixels associated with the tallest or the biggest then individuals. And so these then are regions then of the planet that have disproportionately more of the biggest trees, right? In terms of stored carbon, but also in terms of their potential metabolic impact in terms of both carbon and nutrient then cycling. And we can then overlay future climate change scenarios with drought. Because one thing that tends to kill trees is drought. And we want to know where these regions of extreme drought are going to be located by looking at drought frequency and severity. So this color here is bad, okay? That's both more severe and increasing severity. And so we can do this for kind of best case, climate change scenarios, or the worst case climate change scenarios. And one thing that actually kind of pops out is that there's actually in yellow here, large parts of the planet actually that are going to have lessening drought. But in terms of where the current distribution then of forests are, a lot of those yellow areas don't tend to overlap with them as much. But we can then identify these extreme drought risk locations and kind of lay on top of that potential risk to the global above ground biomass and carbon. So we can at least begin to identify regions of the planet that are likely disproportionately really important in terms of if we lose them, then that would have a disproportionate impact on the biosphere's ability to store and process then carbon. And so it turns out that if we look at best case climate change scenarios and worst case climate change scenarios, in terms of the potential mortality risk of the largest trees, we're potentially looking at a little over half then of the regions of the planet that will be experiencing exceptionally strong and severe droughts, which is a good indicator then of potential mortality risk. Okay. So this is all work in prep. Okay, so we're still kind of wrestling with how to how to deal with these issues. But then I just want to kind of conclude here with that we covered some bit of ground here. I kind of started with how best we can integrate botanical observation data to say something about forecasting extinction, but also say something about the functioning of the biosphere. And there's many questions that this brings up, including how we can better this. You know, are there alternative ways that we can make similar predictions? But in general, if I kind of step back and not think so much about the gloom and doom, it's actually a really exciting time in terms of biodiversity science, because now we have not only all of these new data sets and ways of integrating them, but it's becoming increasingly clear that we can really start kind of honing kind of our science to try to improve our forecasting and predictive abilities. And so kind of all of this really does offer a new lens, I think, by how we kind of best move forward and say something a little bit more quantitative about how human land use, as well as our decisions with conservation and planning on top of climate change, how that will then influence changes in biodiversity and the functioning then of the biosphere. And so kind of with that, I just want to thank the many institutions as well as people that have been involved in a lot of this work. So thank you for listening.
Nathan, thank you very much. It said I'd provide an opportunity for those people who wanted to go to the COP meeting across the road to do so at 10:02, and it is 10:02 now. So if you want to head across to that now, please do before we start the questions.
Yeah, Brian, great talk. And lots of neat points you brought up, but I'm curious about the database that you initially started.
Yeah.
And looking at rarity. And I'm wondering what's the time signature on that database, especially with those rare observations? Are they spanning the past century? Are they spanning the past 20 years? Or what can you tell me about the time element?
So then the question is associated with looking at the original biodiversity data, and if anything having to do with time of sampling, if the time of sampling then somehow may impact this or is disproportionate in some locations than others. There is temporal heterogeneity in terms of sampling, kind of no doubt. We did a first pass of looking to see if that had any potential kind of impact on some of these rarity hotspots, as well as if it had an impact on whether or not some of these names are taxonomically a little bit more interesting, that is falling outside of known taxonomic knowledge. And so for first passes through that, we didn't see necessarily a big impact then of that. So there is some temporal heterogeneity, and I think we went through and did this now. It'd be good to look at using time since collection as a potential covariate, because I think we'll have even more data where we can say something more about it.
Do you think, are there any sort of trends with even rarity increasing over time or anything like that?
That's a great question. Don't know. Yeah, don't know.
Nina first.
In the second section with the graph that was like area conserved against extinction risk, I was wondering what's happening with Asia.
Yeah, Asia's really, and so if you were astute, Asia was a little different because the RCP 2.6 and 8.5, those curves are reversed. So yeah, we went through the data and tried to figure out what's going on there. And the only thing that I can say is that it looks like the geographic scope, the fact that you have a lot of different islands and the fact that under those different climate change scenarios, there are differences in precipitation and things that are going to be happening that comes out differentially in 2.6 and 8.5. Yeah, but it is really interesting. And that's something that we definitely want to dig into a little bit more. We wanted to try to rerun these to see if that interesting difference in Asia, this is in tropical Asia, okay, whether or not that still holds. But I think it has to do with the fact that you're dealing with, you know, so many kind of islands and things surrounded by water. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. That was a really amazing talk. I was really interested in the maps you produced with the zonation and the sort of predictions going forward. And I had sort of two questions. One thing that occurred to me was, could you use the same thing to say which of the protected areas that exist now are most useful to maintain, to lower extinction risk? You know, kind of because that's kind of a given in what you've done. And then I suppose I was interested to know, have people adopted those zonations things? Has that turned into protected area designation and those sort of things yet? Because yeah, amazing stuff.
Yeah, so can we use the zonation approach to ask the additional question, almost turn it the problem on its head and ask what are of the current protected areas, which ones are disproportionately important? Really good question. The quick answer is no, we haven't looked at that, but I know that, for example, Hannah and Patrick, they're both very much interested in that. I know others are, you know, as well. But you can use the same approach then to say of the existing protected areas, which ones really are disproportionately important in terms of keeping them, right? Because there's also a risk, you know, the assumption here is that all these protected areas are going to stay in place, right? But it's a very strong risk that a lot of these actually are no longer going to become protected areas as well. Yeah, you could use the same methods to ask those questions.
A related question to that before we let Yiping in, which was obviously lots of businesses are interested in this sort of analysis at the moment. I guess, to put it crudely, to work out where they can destroy rather than where we should protect and you know where they can't. And I wondered how your interactions with businesses got on, or your colleagues.
Yeah, so actually through Mike. One of the big issues that I think we're going to have to wrestle with, let me just digress just a little bit. We step back and look at all this biodiversity data. This has all been funded by taxpayers across the world, right? And good-natured people and businesses, you know, all pitching in. But a lot of these data and the products are still behind these firewalls of no use for financial benefit, right? But that also is kind of separating out a bunch of entities, you know, with financial interests that could probably leverage with many more resources than what we have in terms of actually doing something good with it. So I'm not quite sure if this fully answers your question, but I do think that we're going to have to wrestle things with intellectual property rights and the fact that there are people out there that want to make money, you know, with biodiversity.
Would you believe it? Yeah.
So.
Yeah, no, that does starts to address the question. Yiping, what move for Yiping and one more question, I think.
Yeah, thank you for a great talk. I had a question about the extinction risk from this incredible assemblage of all different sources of data. My understanding is that it's always an issue of realized niche versus fundamental niche, and the fact that extinction risk might also be related to migration. And I was just wondering, is there any way this kind of information has been integrated in the assessment of extinction risk?
So the question is associated with how the various different assumptions of these species distribution model and climate niche models and the various assumptions then used, especially in terms of forecasting in the future, how then that can impact these results, right? So that's a very good question. I think a really good analysis to do would be to go through and generate these curves with these by changing these different assumptions. We played a little bit with that. I can point you to a few papers where we've done that for specific taxonomic groups, but not for the zonation work. I don't know if I went through it a little quick, but one thing that we did do was we clamped down the dispersal barriers. I'm sorry, we used a dispersal kernel that's realistic on the timescale that we're modeling. And so we used estimates then of dispersal kernels for plants and animals, and then we chose some realistic, so we're not kind of forecasting things to move instantaneously across the planet, right? There's definitely some hysteresis having to do with known dispersal kernels. And we also try to clamp down the realistic niche kind of parameters, enforcing things like unimodal distributions then for climate, instead of having open-ended kind of functions kind of underlying then these kinds of species. So we've been trying to assess the relative importance of that, but I think it's a really important question, and someone needs to do a much deeper dive to look at the sensitivity and maybe some robust general